Now that 2024 has wrapped up, I think it's a good opportunity to provide some book recommendations based on my reading in the past year. In 2025, I hope to do a bit more of this. I'm going to begin formalizing my study at an institution, and so part of that, I hope, is a shifting of this channel to include more content based on referring and translating academic material as I come through it. And so to start this, I thought that considering what I've been able to read in 2024, it'd be a good opportunity to work through some of those works, give like a book review and a recommendation according to what aspect of theology it's useful for and how much I think it's useful for the personal development of people. So two works that I actually started in late 2023, but I read the substantial amount of in 2024. Well, the first was The Perfection of the Spiritual Life by St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, this is probably one of the best works I've read in the previous year. St. Thomas in this particular work is doing something that's a little bit more apologetical, but he touches on the spiritual life and spiritual theology quite deeply. So he's responding to a particular claim at his time, which was that the parish priest and archdeacons of a diocese have a perfect state in life. Now, I know that this is a position that even later writers struggle to grapple with in St. Thomas's writings, but I'm pretty compelled by the reasoning throughout the work, which was that he's arguing about how only the bishop and the religious contain a perfect state in life. But to do this, he has a thorough exposition on the religious life, on the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and why they amount to a perfect state. And in it is a beautiful exposition on the goodness of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so even though it's rooted in this discussion or this debate that he's having with others, and because at a certain point towards the end of the work, he kind of comes back to the work to respond to further claims that were made against the first portion of his work. But beyond just the back and forth, the controversial nature of the document in its broader controversy, it provides one of the best expositions on the spiritual life, spiritual theology that I've personally read, and in it inspired me as a layperson, as somebody who intends to get married, who's engaged to get married. It shaped my own spiritual life, even though it's talking about the spirituality of the religious and their own life under poverty, chastity, and obedience. You when you read the counsels as counsels and distill from them the precepts that apply to all people, and then the counsel in as much as it can be approached by lay people in their lay state, it's quite an inspiring work to the spiritual life. It's long. It took me quite a while to really get into it for one of St. Thomas's shorter works. But by the end of it, I found it to be one of the most edifying works I've read in the past year, and something that I was reading off my iPad, just highlighted continuously large chunks of the work because it was that captivating. The next work I read was the Introduction to Philosophy by Father Austin Woodbury. So in the hopes of trying to formalize a bit more of my study, I tried to read what is effectively an introduction, but in the form of lecture notes. So if you're not familiar who Father Austin Woodbury was, he's an Australian Marist brother, I believe, but he studied under Father Garrigou-Lagrange, and he is probably one of the most, in terms of his theological writings as a Thomist, having written in English, having taught in English in Australia, he was writing at a very high level. So in terms of systematic theology, especially from a Thomistic perspective, he's quite invaluable to English readers, even though he's not extremely prominently known. He is definitely better known in Australia because Campion College here, which is a liberal arts college, is located where at the Old Mara Seminary where he used to teach. And so he's established a bit of a Thomistic legacy in Sydney. And so because of that, I was a bit inspired to want to read his introduction to philosophy. However, this one was a bit of a drag because it's actually lecture notes. You don't get what would have been his edifying exposition in class, which would have taken what was a bit dry on paper and brought it to life in person. And as an introduction to philosophy, it definitely didn't feel like an introduction. It got into particulars about rather niche things that didn't seem very applicable. Now, I might be going at it the wrong way because a large reason of why I want to study philosophy is to help me work within the philosophical frameworks necessary for higher dogmatic theology. And so, as much as I want to love philosophy for philosophy in itself, I am definitely studying philosophy with that view in mind. And so it didn't seem very edifying in itself. There were some things that I liked, but for the most part, it wasn't a great introduction. And it kind of stopped me from wanting to read more of other fathers, Father Austin Woodbury's works, unfortunately. After this, I went through a period in early January when I was on retreat with the Benedictine monks of reading some spiritual works. Now, one of the practices on retreat is they play an audiobook for you to listen to. And so the audiobook we worked through on the retreat during eating periods was Padre Pio's biography by Father Gabriel Amorth. And this one actually surprised me because I wasn't aware that Father Gabriel Amorth knew Padre Pio and met him in his lifetime. It was a very good, interesting life story about Padre Pio. It captures a lot of the common anecdotes that people give about Padre Pio, but in something that was written by someone who knew him, but who was also in himself a respectable member of the church. Father Amorth was I believe he was the head exorcist at Rome. And so it's two names. It's a well-known Catholic exorcist writing about one of the greatest saints of the 20th century. So it was definitely a very edifying listen at retreat. The next work I listened to was The Life of St. Benedict, which was actually written by St. Gregory the Great. And this was another writing I think I read right at the end of the retreat. And so even though as a Maronite, I'm heavily exploring Syriac monastic spirituality, the Benedictines have formed the basis of my understanding of monasticism. As someone who grew up in a Western-speaking country, thinking a lot of theology in terms of Western categories and Western ways of understanding, the vagaries that are common today among some of the Eastern churches, including the Maronite Church, and the way they engage in theology, which I've come to the conclusion is not reflective of Eastern theology in itself. It's just a modern tendency to keep things obscure among us. That made a kind of impenetrable wall for me to understand Maronite spirituality. So the Benedictines, because they are so authentically representative of monasticism in its early expression in the West, there is such commonalities in the principles of spirituality that made it a bridge for me so that I'm able to understand Maronite spirituality, but explained with the precision and the clarity that I'm familiar with and that I resonate with in the categories I think of. And so Benedictine spirituality and studying the rule of St. Benedict, the life of St. Benedict, has been something that I've worked through systematically. And the life of St. Benedict is rather extraordinary. Now, it was written, like I said, by St. Gregory the Great, who is, even in the East, is known as the Dialogos for his dialogues. And, I mean, you don't get many saint biographies written by other saints, and it's a patristic biography written by another patristic writer. So I can't recommend it enough. The stories of St. Benedict's life are extraordinary. He walked on water. He bilocated. He could read the minds of his monks. I mean, everyone knows the common stories of how he survived poison and assassination attempts. But the book is so short and full of these colorful anecdotes, one after the other. You don't get bored reading the life of St. Benedict. It's very, very small. It's very well written. And I always love I still remember how it started because it just hit me so beautifully the way St. Gregory the Great begins talking about St. Benedict as one who is both blessed in name and in grace. I mean, St. Benedict, or Benedict, means blessed. And so just referring to the Holy Father, our Holy Father, St. Benedict, as blessed in both name and in grace, it just set the tone for the whole work. And it's very short, very interesting, and it's definitely up there in terms of the things I would read, and a definite recommendation. So I'd say Perfection of the Spiritual Life by St. Thomas and The Life of St. Benedict by St. Gregory the Great are, so far of what I've mentioned, the definite reads. The next work was a work called Contraception Revisited, written by the prior of the Benedictine monastery in Tasmania. And it's just an exposition of the Catholic Church's teaching on contraception. I just picked it up. It was a small read. Again, I read it on retreat because I bought it when I was on retreat. And for the most part, the book is just a normal Catholic exposition on contraception. However, the last chapter, which was Father's personal anecdotes of the way contraception has impacted people, because people don't really mourn the sin of contraception the way that people mourn the sin of abortion. And so him talking about that as a priest and his own family experience coming from such a large family, that last chapter is a very strong emotional argument for the Catholic teaching on contraception. So oftentimes our arguments can seem rather sterile and logical, but it doesn't really touch to the heart the way that that Catholic teaching on abortion does. But this was the first particular work that I read that really touched, towards the end at least, on the heart of the issue, that really was be able to move the heart of the Catholic who's struggling to grasp the Catholic Church's teaching because it might seem arbitrary to them. So that was very good, and that was a book I definitely recommended for others to read. The next was Jesus Christ, the Son of God, another small exposition. This was actually just simply a book that was an argumentation for the divinity of Christ, an area of apologetics I've never really read too deeply in. You can read Scripture yourself, and as you read Scripture, you see certain terminology that we're just unfamiliar with in our day and age that can confuse us. When Christ says this, the Father knows. Only the Father knows, but the Son does not know, or the Father is greater than I. Things like that, which if you're heavy into apologetics as I once was, I'm less into it now. You learn to debate all of these things, but just this was a short, simple exposition of scriptural verses that defended the Catholic Nicene teaching of Christ's divinity, and something that I think would definitely be useful for anyone who's interested in apologetics against Judaism or Islam. It was rather short, but it was a very good work. The next was the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, which I actually listened to as an audiobook over 9 months. And this is an interesting one. It's a classic and everyone recommends it, but as a work in itself, it's less imitable in many ways if you don't have a proper understanding, I think, of spiritual theology. Because when you read the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, which was written by Saint Palladius and recorded the sayings and doings of the monks, particularly of the monastery of Skiti in Egypt, but of all the Alexandrian Egyptian monks of the desert from which monasticism was born, it's recording their sayings and their doings. It's astonishing because, again, so much happened in Egypt in this era, and it was from Egypt that monasticism went westwards, because you had people from Greece and you had people from the Latin West come to the desert to study monasticism. And the famous one, two famous Western Latin saints was Saint Arsenius, who was a deacon in Rome, who was then also went to Constantinople to teach the emperor's children, to tutor them before he fled to the desert. And Saint Arsenius is one of the most prominent saints in the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. So is Saint Moses the Black, Saint Sosoas the Great, Saint Paphnutius. So there's a few that are really prominent. There's a few that get occasional mention. Saint Anthony the Great is mentioned as well, but not heavily, not the center. I mean, if you want to read the life of Saint Anthony the Great, you want to read Saint Athanasius the Great's works on him. So the Saints of the Desert Fathers was really good. It's a definite thing to read. The only recommendation is that for you to edify your own spiritual life as someone who isn't an ascetic, or even if you are an ascetic, even if you're part of a religious order today, you'll notice how different the religious expression was then. I think it's important to have underpinning that the like a basic level of spiritual theology. Like if you've read St. Thomas's Perfection of the Spiritual Life, you understand what the counsels are, that they're means for perfections, but they're not in themselves necessary for perfection. One can be perfected without the counsels, but the counsels are more effective means. You can start to understand what motivated the Desert Fathers in their particular expression of spirituality. One thing as well, because the next book I read, which is also another must read in my opinion, is The Rule of St. Benedict. So I've been reading a lot on monastic spirituality to edify my own Maronite Syriac monastic spirituality. The Rule of St. Benedict that I read was the Baronius Press edition, which has a particular essay printed at the front of it by a Benedictine cardinal. I cannot remember who it was, but it's a phenomenal essay. Like the rule and the essay I want to discuss separately. The essay just basically discussed how, what we were just talking about, which was the Alexandrian Desert Fathers who lived so long and lived such extraordinary forms of asceticism, was something that people could not imitate. And so over time, you had the establishment of various rules and monastic living to regularize the expression of asceticism for the majority of religious ascetics, while also keeping a reverence for those who could do more and then therefore became hermits in that capacity. So the first expression of this would be Saint Basil the Great's rule, which Saint Benedict himself had and refers to in his own rule explicitly. But the essay discusses how the climate of Europe in the 5th century, in the early 5th century, late 4th century, where St. Benedict was operating, was not conducive for the life of asceticism lived in the desert. And so these European monks, trying to imitate what the Alexandrian monks did, were not achieving it. Even though, this isn't because they were European. Obviously, the Latin Desert Fathers who went to Egypt, St. John Cassian, who I forgot to mention, Arsenius, and then John Cassian, he lived in the desert, recorded his conferences, and then brought them back to the West. And so the rule of St. Basil and the conferences of St. John Cassian, which is recording the Alexandrian expression, the Egyptian monastic expression, come together as the basis to form the rule of St. Benedict, which just becomes the standardized universal expression of monasticism in the West. It's phenomenal. And these things, people sometimes say, oh, you're a layperson. What's the point of reading these monastic rules? I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, because religious aren't opposed to this. Religious understand that the rule of St. Benedict, the rule of St. Basil, all of these expressions of higher perfection in Christianity are simply trying to create perfect Christians. And so contained within them, even though they are documents that instantiate counsels for those living a particular state in life that they vow to then perform, and so they become rules, they still represent principles of perfection that anyone can access. So you could read the rule of St. Benedict and how he talks about the governance of the monastery, the relation between the abbot and his inferiors, and even something that's a bit more controversial today. The concept of mutual submission in relation to the abbot to the monks below him. While St. Benedict still talks about the absolute submission that the monks need to show to their superior. The concept of mutual submission in light of St. Benedict's writings makes it very clear, and is a very healthy understanding of the true forms of headship that exist in the marriage of a man and a woman and the children that they procreate. And so understanding that the rules that govern monasteries are actually simply guiding virtuous Christians to communal life, then it's quite clear that those rules in principle are very translatable to those who have the ability to discern it and understand it to their own lives. And so the rule of St. Benedict, beyond just if you're trying to become a Benedictine oblate or join a Benedictine monastery in itself, it's very useful in terms of understanding the principles of spirituality, especially if you're a Westerner, because St. Benedict's writings and his construction of the office became effectively the normal form in the West. And so St. Benedict's even governance and understanding of monasteries will help a proper headship of the father in the household, and also how he as the father is supposed to relate to the desires and needs of those who he has the responsibility to care for, namely his wife and his children. And so there's a lot there for even married people if they're discerning enough to grasp. And so the rule of St. Benedict, particularly the Baronius Press edition with the essay of monasticism in the West at the beginning, is another small patristic work which is quite well worth listening to. The next, it was a small devotional work that I picked up on St. Jude Thaddeus, St. Jude the Apostle, whose story I wasn't familiar with. The Chaldeans will know it quite well because it relates to their origins, but it's the story of St. Jude and him going eastwards to King Akbar or Angbar. I can't remember his name exactly, but he supposedly, this is a legend according to most people, but when I read this, I wasn't aware that most people consider it a legend, and I was quite moved by the story. The idea that during this particular king, who I'm going to look his name up, King Angbar? No, now I'm mixing that up with Lord of the Rings. King Akbar. Yeah, so King Akbar, he was a king in the Far East, in the Persian Empire, I believe it was, or if not in the Persian Empire, somewhere between kind of Rome and Persia. And supposedly in his lifetime he was sick, and he called for this man who he knew was working wonders in Judea, in Israel, and this was Jesus Christ. And after our Lord died, supposedly St. Jude Thaddeus took a veil that had imprinted on it the face of Christ to King Akbar, and this catalyzed the conversion of King Akbar and his people. Either way, it was a good devotional work for a saint who I don't have a massive devotion for, but seems to kind of reappear in my life in various ways. So it was a good little read. The next was Divine Providence and Human Freedom, another work that I picked up from the monks, the Benedictine monastery in Tasmania of the Priory of Notre Dame. This one was good. Not a topic that I was particularly curious about when I started reading it. I did definitely get more interested in the question of grace and predestination later in the year, but at the time I read it, it wasn't really too pertinent in my own interest. So I found it an interesting read, but it wasn't particularly amazing, but it was a good treatment on the topic. The next work I read was a small essay on the origins of the Maronites, prepared by he's now a priest at our monastery, but at the time he wrote it as a brother studying. And this was my first serious introduction into learning Maronite history. Since then, this was in April last year I started, and later in the year I uploaded a few videos on the channel about Maronite history, Maronite spirituality, the lives of Saint Maroun. I did a massive deep dive into my own tradition in the last year. And so part of that was started with this. Moving into the history, after kind of studying the spirituality, I went to the history side of things and then the theology. And so this began it, a small edifying understanding of Maronite history from more or less Saint Maroun to John Maroun. The next work was Apologetics in Catholic Doctrine. Now this is a reprint by a priest who I'm actually quite close to, but he reprinted this work and it was written by Archbishop Shihan. Now, it was originally a textbook that was aimed for high school students, but like most older works, they can be surprisingly more substantive than what you would expect high school students or children or whatever they're written to be able to actually process. The work, however, does have throughout it 2 font sizes, kind of an overview and then a more in-depth explanation. And it's a basic theology textbook. It goes through what you'd consider fundamental theology, natural theology, moving into then sacred theology, and working through your standard Trinitarian theology, Christology, Mariology, ecclesiology, eschatology. And so you work through these various things, and I found it really edifying. This was actually one of the first works that I adopted a new method of consuming, which was actually to use an AI reader. As weird as this sounds, there was a Catholic YouTuber I used to follow quite a lot, and I was amazed at the amount of reading he could take in. And he mentioned that the way he does it, some people found it weird, but one of the things he does is that he uses AI readers to read to him while he's doing other things. And this kind of was like a light bulb moment for me, because I used to spend so much time listening to podcasts that I'm like, well, if I could replace all that podcast time with listening, I'd be able to get through a lot of books. And that's what I did. I mean, I got through the substantial amount of this book. I'd started it, and then a few months later, I decided I wanted to finish it. So I was 100 pages into a 600-page book. I worked through 500 pages of it in a month using an AI reader. And mostly while I was driving to work and back and forth and doing things. And I highly recommend it, actually. One of the key things, like I mentioned, is that most of this reading was orientated towards a systematization or formalization of my own personal learning that I've been trying to do. And I viewed this work as the key to that, because it was in the standard form of approaching theology, like I mentioned. It's a particular structure. You do natural theology, what is God as we know him from reason, what are God's properties, and then move into sacred theology, which begins first and foremost with his revelation as triune, and then Christ, the incarnation, which is all centered around Christology, and you move through the doctrines in a particular way. So most textbooks, whether you're reading something like the Summa, whether you're reading St. John Damascene's work, or Ludwig Ott, or Apologetics and Catholic Doctrine, they follow this structure. But knowing that this was quote unquote at an easier level, I read through it, but I still found it extremely edifying. As somebody who's worked through catechisms and used to do most of my formation through catechisms, this is definitely a step above a catechism. So if most of your deep reading, so to speak, has been the Roman Catechism or the Baltimore Catechism or the Catechism of the Catholic Church, then this is definitely a move, I think, towards something a bit more substantive. Maybe not the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because that does cover more than just your 4 basic exposition on the Decalogue, the Trinity, the sacraments, and the eschatology. But at least from your older catechisms, this is a stepwards up. But then after that, the work I kind of worked through heavily was Faith Comes from What Is Heard, which is an introduction to fundamental theology written by Dr. Lawrence Feingold, who is a contemporary theologian. And this was very, very good. I really, really enjoyed studying fundamental theology in a way that I didn't think I would, because I thought, for me, what I'd be really keen to pick up would be all the dogmatic stuff, dogmatic facts. And my passion is positive theology. So just kind of keeping it in the realm of theory without talking about patristic sources or things like that, I thought I'd be like bored out of my mind. But understanding theology and specifically understanding what faith is, because part of the discussion so fundamental theology contains a few things. It's firstly, what is theology? Theology as a science, theology as a wisdom, understanding the mode under which theology proceeds. Is it natural theology, which proceeds from human reason? Is it sacred theology, which principally proceeds from divine revelation, which is formally or properly contained in sacred scripture and tradition? And then what is faith, and what makes faith reasonable? What are the motives of credibility? So, and then, discussing those motives of credibility. Well, why can we trust who Jesus says he is? So before you even, step into the doctrines of the Catholic Church, of the sacred theology, it's discussing what everything's about, and why we're even doing it, and why it's worthwhile. And to me, the understanding the motives of credibility, so that is the motives of credibility as distinct from faith, was critical, because I think I realized an error in my own understanding in life, which is that I associated faith with knowledge, I associated faith with having an answer to objections, when faith, first and foremost, is the virtue by which we assent to the truths of faith on account of God as its witness. And that last bit was the thing that I always missed out in my understanding. I always knew that faith was a virtue by which we assent to the supernatural truths of the Catholic Church. But the motive of why that's reasonable, which is we believe in something, we have faith in something, we have absolute certainty in something. Not because we've studied it, not because we've come to a conclusion through an examination. It's because, first and foremost, God said it, and God is not a liar. That's the basis. That assent comes first, prior to, all the deep-rooted patristic studies or defense of the Gospels and, all the apologetics we do. That's not faith. That is understood in light of the assent of faith we make. And so that was a really key understanding that the assent of faith is made first and foremost on the reasonableness of Christ's claims. And once that assent is made, understanding can proceed. But all the exploration we do, like, is the church who he says it is? We study the Gospels. Are they historical? These things are what we call motives of credibility. They make the assent of faith reasonable. We can't just believe some person who came to this earth and said, I'm God, worship me. He needs to come demonstrating a reason to believe his claims. And that's what our Lord did. But then furthermore, when the church is seeking us to accept its doctrines, there are certain motives of credibility that are provided for us to go, this is Christ's true church, therefore its doctrines are true. And so you can do all the study you want on, the papacy. Read every ecumenical council and church father on it. But the divine assent of faith is something that is rooted first and foremost in the credibility of the witness of the doctrines, which is Christ himself, who is God, who cannot lie. And then from there, you can grasp understanding. And we need to do positive theology, because that's what makes somebody from the outside say, hey, look, it seems reasonable. Like, the Catholic Church is claiming this claim, and they've got all this evidence. So it seems like a reasonable claim. So I don't seem absurd for making a divine assent of faith. But faith is fundamentally distinct. And to me, that's what I really benefited a lot from studying Feingold's work. The next was a book which was actually published by my eparchy. It's called The Maronite Church, Roots and Missions. And it was just a series of essays. This was part in my initial study of the Maronite faith, kind of just wanting to get a basic understanding of the history. Had a couple of good essays in there about St. Maroun and the history of the Maronite Church. Beyond just St. John Maroun, which was useful, that's what I got out of this one particularly, was that it was the history of the Maronite Church after its formalized establishment with a new patriarchal line. And that includes through the medieval age and into the later centuries, into the modern age. There was also in it published a synod document from the Maronite Synod in 2005. And I found this to be extremely, extremely useful as a guide for what the Maronite Church needs today. It's been 20 years now, and we're still in need of the things that it's asked for, especially expositions of the faith and our history in the vernacular language that our people are now speaking, which is something that is lacking drastically. And also a need, this was the one that stood out to me, and I think this is what's established a movement in my own trajectory in terms of where I want to take my studies, which is and the Maronites need to appeal more to our common Antiochian tradition. So much of our focus can be on later things, but we mustn't forget that first and foremost we are the Antiochian church, or and in that understanding of the Antiochian church, that means that part of our patrimony is the whole Antiochian church. That includes the schools of Antioch, Edessa, Nisibis. And so we need to embrace them, not just limit ourselves to a particular Syriac expression, but to recognize that the Greek-speaking Antiochian saints like St. John Chrysostom, St. Ignatius of Antioch, all of them, they're also part of our tradition, and we need to incorporate them in our discussion and not just limit ourselves to individuals or great and holy saints like St. Ephrem, St. Jacob of Sarug, St. Isaac of Nineveh, two of the three of which were not in canonical unity with us when we established ourselves as a bulwark of Chalcedonian Christology. So that was a good takeaway. I think particular essays in there are useful if you're Maronite and you really want to get serious about studying the Maronite faith. The next is Difficulties in Mental Prayer. This was a work that I picked up, written by a Trappist monk called Dom Eugene Boylan. Now, this work is definitely one of the must-reads. This is definitely one of the must-read works of this year. This is a book that presumes you're already practicing mental prayer, probably practicing it for a good year or a few years. And it's the presumption is that you're practicing it according to the methods of St. Ignatius of Loyola or St. Therese of Avila's method. And so the assumption is that you've began practicing mental prayer, you've already established the natural habit of doing it often, but you struggle a lot. And that's because the method that you've used to begin has now become an obstacle to progress. And so the whole book is off this premise, that the method is a means to an end and must never become an obstacle to attaining that end. And so it really talks about what is mental prayer in itself. And I don't think I ever knew it, nor do I think I ever practiced it until I started reading this book. I was so focused on the mental imagery of St. Ignatius's method and of trying to actually get through the reading I had in front of me, not realizing that all of these things are ascending to what we call a form of affective prayer, which even can find itself totally detached from any active use of materials in the context of meditation. And I thought that this work was phenomenal, and it's the work that I've been recommending to everyone. His writing is very lucid, it's very clear, but it's with a clarity that isn't technical. It's with a clarity that is of a deep understanding of the workings of the prayer lives of those at the beginning of mental prayer, which is something that some authors, I think, can become detached from, that they've progressed so far. But the great teacher is always someone who remembers how it was when you began learning. And he's speaking as if somebody at the other end of the tunnel is calling back to you, and he remembers how it was to come through the tunnel. And so he's giving you all this advice. And whenever I read the work, I noticed a tangible improvement in my meditation that day. And just the clarity and the beauty of his exposition of what mental prayer was. So this is a definite must read, in my opinion. The next was The Bodily Assumption of Mary by Father Woodbury. I mentioned Father Woodbury earlier. This was a small little text, interesting, apologetical. If you have an interest in the topic, you can find the PDF online. It's worth reading. Otherwise, it's nothing groundbreaking or extraordinary. It was actually written at the time that the doctrine was promulgated, and so it was useful, a useful exposition of understanding what the doctrine was, why the church was able to dogmatize it, which was a question in the past. Would a doctrine like the bodily assumption of Our Lady be something that could be dogmatized? And so he goes through those things. Good work, nothing too special. The next was St. Ephraim's Hymns on Paradise. This was the first work of St. Ephrem that I've worked through in its entirety. This was translated by by Sebastian Brock, and its production value as produced by St. Vladimir's Press is phenomenal. It's a very highly academic work in the sense that it's a good level of footnotes, there's a good level of references, but in a way that doesn't impede spiritual reading. And the essays by Brock as an introduction to Ephrem, who he is, his writings, etc. And at the back, the other essay, or a couple of pages discussing the translations and which translations of Ephrem are apocryphal, which ones of them do we have certainty about. It's from both an academic and a spiritual perspective, a book I would highly, highly recommend if you are interested in approaching the Syriac Fathers. If you're a Maronite, Syriac Catholic, even if you're a Melkite because you're part of the Antiochian Church, or if you're just anyone who's interested in Syriac writing. Now, it's important to understand St. Ephrem's mode of doing theology was what we call poetic theology. He wrote in a Syriac poetical style which uses something that's called parallelism. So they don't do poetry the way we do poetry, which is basically, we do a lot of rhyming with our poetry. That's what makes something a poem, more not technically, but poem rhymes. In Syriac, poems don't rhyme. One of the characteristic aspects of poetry as opposed to prose is that poetry has parallelisms, which is that a particular point is repeated twice. So you say something one way and then you say it again, but in a different way. And when I first came across this in my reading a couple of years ago in the writings of St. Jacob of Sarug and his homilies on Elijah, it was agony to get through, because basically when you're reading it and you're reading it like prose, you're thinking this is just like the Book of Kings, but just done more watered down and with unnecessary repetitions. But you have to understand that it's a catechetical, pedagogical style, that somebody will be listening to these things and they're hearing everything said twice. And in that context, there is, it is said a second time in a different way. And that's kind of when you teach somebody something, that's what you do. You say something one way and then you explain the same concept to them, but in a slightly different way. And then that will help for deeper understanding. But it's in this context where it's being listened to and sung, not just read. And so to facilitate like a meaningful extraction of spiritual edification out of St. Ephrem's work, I found that I would read it 2 pages a day and read it twice and just use it almost like a lectio. Because if you read it once, the powerfulness of his writings will just go over your head. It's not a piece of prose where you can just read it and accumulate facts in your head, where the value of the text is that it's an accumulation of an argument of various facts that are put together and it comes to some deeper understanding. It's something that you need to ruminate on. It's something you need to think about. It's something that you need to meditate about. And so it's good meditative material, but it's not for everybody. And it definitely wasn't for me. But I think that when it wasn't for me, when I read St. Jacob, but reading St. Ephrem and approaching it differently, I was able to get quite a lot out of it. So I definitely enjoyed it, and I'm going to seek out more writings by Sebastian Brock or more of his translations on St. Ephrem, because in terms of Syriac spirituality, St. Ephrem is phenomenal. He's a doctor of the church, if you're unaware of that, and his writings are quite valuable in the sense that for a long time we only had part of him that was in Greek and Latin, and all the fathers who had anything of Ephrem, including St. Jerome, spoke extremely highly of him. It was like that was in the Greek, which St. Jerome pointed out. St. Jerome was like, I read some of his writings in Greek, and even in the translation you could tell the mind of a brilliant intellect. That's just paraphrasing St. Jerome's comment about St. Ephrem. And so we only really had significant access to St. Ephrem in the original Syriac in the last couple of centuries. when we were able to start actually translating direct translations into our languages, as opposed to the problem which we had before, which was that was all these apocryphal works, and even the ones that weren't apocryphal, were translated from Syriac to Greek to Latin to French and then to English. And it's like, okay, well, this is extremely watered down. And now academia, like Sebastian Brock, is coming in and doing, straight Syriac to English, with still taking the opinions of other translators to kind of come up with the best understanding of how it's supposed to be translated. That still, it's a direct and refined translation. When read right and reading it in its intention will bring a lot of edification to you. It's important to also understand that one of the values of these Syriac writers is that they are writing in a Semitic style. And so in terms of language, they have a lot of the tropes that you're going to find in the Bible, because it's still a Semitic culture. And so those expressions, the way of teaching theology here is akin to the practice that was utilized by the Israelites for so long, which is forms of poetry that help the people keep these ideas within their mind and to ponder them, because these things were read to them and they heard it in such a way that was repetitious and they could understand it. And so you can see even in our Lord's writings, these parallelisms that come about. He does them quite often. Like the most obvious example of an oral tactic would be the Beatitudes. Blessed are those, blessed are those, blessed are those, for they. It's just this repetitive style, but you see this in the poetry of the Syriacs, in the Syriacs especially. And so, but again, part of that is that we lose certain things in translations. Like, Psalm 118 or 119, depending on the numbering, is a famous alphabetical psalm, which you'll never know if you read it in English, because when you translate words from Hebrew to English, they're not going to all keep the same alphabet ordering. But if you were to read it in Hebrew, it's basically an alphabetical psalm where it's the first eight lines all start with Aleph, the next 8 with Be, and so on and so on. And Syriac is the same. So we lose a bit of it in English, but it's still extremely edifying. The next text that I worked through was the Apostolic Fathers. So I read these twice, back to back. I read first Philip Schaff's translations of the Apostolic Fathers, which included the Didache, St. Clement's first and second letters, St. Ignatius of Antioch's 7 letters, the martyrdom of St. Ignatius, Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, Polycarp's martyrdom, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Epistle of Matthias to Diognetus, and then some fragments of Papias. And I loved it so much that I just then picked up the Apostolic Fathers edition and I read it. The Apostolic Fathers are, to me, like the gold that I discovered this year. They were so short. It's about, I read both of them in a week. Like I read it twice. I read it in 1 week and then I read it again in another week. They're very short. It's basically in the same style of the epistles towards the end of the New Testament, like St. Paul and St. Peter's epistles. It's extremely interesting. I definitely recommend the Penguins edition, because having read it a second time and having read it with the introductions being made by the authors, in terms of like, St. Ignatius wrote this letter when he was here and he wrote it in this context because these people came to visit them. So he went, all of that information was extremely useful for contextualizing the letters. So when I read the letters initially without that context, they were great. They were phenomenal even. But reading it a second time and understanding that context was even better. So definite recommendation. These fathers they lived in the time of, they're called the Apostolic Fathers because they all knew the apostles personally, one or more. St. Ignatius and St. Polycarp, they were friends and both disciples of St. John the Beloved. And so these writings, they are They are not just mere apologetical works that we use against Protestants when we want to prove the Eucharist. They are rich with many different Catholic dogmas and doctrines that are contained throughout. Not just, we need a quote for the Eucharist, get St. Ignatius of Antioch. I mean, his letters are so short, they could be read in a day. And you've read the corpus of St. Ignatius, and especially if you're a Maronite, St. Ignatius of Antioch is the most prominent patriarch of our church after the Blessed Peter. He wasn't the immediate successor of St. Peter. St. Evodius came after him, but St. Ignatius of Antioch knew St. Peter as well, and St. Peter appointed St. Ignatius to succeed St. Evodius after St. Evodius succeeded St. Peter. The final work I read was a history of the monks of Syria by Theodoret of Cyrus. This work I read. It wasn't the work I finished last. I started it last, more or less. I started it last, but I finished it before some other works because I needed to get this done so that I could write the talk on St. Maroun and his disciples. Now, this work is a compilation of anecdotes by Theodoret of Cyrus about the lives of various monks throughout Syria. And the reason this is such a useful work is because in it is the only record we have of St. Maroun and his disciples. And so for me, as a Maronite, that's extremely valuable, that's extremely important, and hence why I read it. But all the other monks were extremely interesting as well. And there's a difference. Having read so much into Western monasticism and the Saints of the Desert Fathers, which is Egyptian monasticism, and now having read into, Antiochian monasticism in the Syrian expression, there's a clear difference between what was happening in Syria to the rest of the world. See, Egypt was from Egypt that monasticism went to Europe and went upwards towards Asia Minor with the Cappadocians. Okay, what happened in Syria happened parallel to Egypt. So you see different things, especially in the lives of St. Maroun and his disciples. Now, by the mid-5th century, you start to see the regularization of monasticism as well. And so they all start to regularize the same way. But the origins of these monks are different to the origins of the Egyptian monks. And I brought this up in my talk, but in the lives of the Desert Fathers of Egypt, St. Palladius records heavily an emphasis on work and a cloistered living in one's cell. Even the hermit is one who lives in a cell. In Syria, you don't see heavy emphasis on labor. In fact, I don't even know if all of them did labor. They were self-sustainable, but some of them lived off food that was donated to them by people around them. But they were also characterized by outdoor living. And a form of asceticism that was exposed to the elements. So there is a really interesting difference there if you're super into monasticism and monastic history and monastic expressions. The Syrians, so far, from what I've seen, are the most unique. And that's from which Saint Simeon the Stylite emerged, which is who is an extremely well-known saint. But he can seem a bit random, right? Like, where did this guy start standing on a pillar from? Well, if you understand his context coming from Syrian monasticism, you can start to see where he got his ideas from. They were almost all trying to one-up each other in terms of their expressions. To some, especially to Protestants, the Syrian monastics represent the worst side of monasticism. If the Protestants condemned the European monastics of their age for their forms of personal asceticism, they would definitely have hated the Syrian expressions even more so. And I've seen it online, even on Twitter, higher Protestants who really are against monasticism. They bring up the life of some of the Syrian Desert Fathers as the examples of those excesses. But to me, they're extraordinary witnesses to grace, extraordinary witnesses to the ascetical life, and so it was a definite recommendation from me. So just to recap, I think the works I definitely think are really worth reading, based on what I've read this year, was The Perfection of the Spiritual Life by St. Thomas Aquinas, which is a perfect synthesis of the evangelical councils and is very inspiring regardless of your state in life. The Life of St. Benedict, written by St. Gregory the Great, which is a patristic work written by one of the greatest early church fathers about one of the greatest early church fathers. The book is extremely colorful. The anecdotes are very exciting. It's short. You don't get bored reading it. The Rule of St. Benedict, which was written by St. Benedict himself and is a great pillar of Western monasticism. And I think, especially if you're a Maronite who wants to try and understand monasticism more, but you come from a Western frame of thinking, this was a massive step for me. So a high recommendation. Apologetics and Catholic Doctrine, a good basic work of theology if you're trying to move from catechisms up into higher theological works. This was written for students, so this presumes that you have no formal theological standing, but the structure of the work is written according to a theology textbook, not a catechism. Catechisms normally cover the 10 Commandments, the 4 last things, the sacraments, and the creed, giving you the basic stuff. This is your Sunday school stuff. Theology normally is structured with like natural theology, which is understanding who is God from human reason. Then we move into sacred theology, Trinity, Christology, Mariology, ecclesiology, grace, eschatology. That structure, which is the basis of most theological works for the last maybe 14th century. I think St. John Damascus used it. St. Thomas uses it. Any work of theology at a decent level is in that structure. And so even though this is written for high school students, their high school students were definitely smarter than ours. And if you don't have an education at their level, then this forms that basis and is a good introduction for it. The next, Faith Comes from What Is Heard, an Introduction to Fundamental Theology by Lawrence Feingold. This was a massive eye-opener. It's a good introduction into fundamental theology and a step towards reading dogmatics. Difficulties in Mental Prayer by Dom Eugene Boylan, the best spiritual work I read this year. I'd even recommend it more than St. Thomas Aquinas' Perfection on the Spiritual Life, but it's a different book, read both. But this was just about mental prayer. Presuming that you've practiced mental prayer according to the methods of St. Ignatius or St. Teresa of Avila, but you're struggling, read this. This is phenomenal. I send quotes to people, I post quotes of this on Twitter, and people are always curious to know what the work is. It really touches to the heart of prayer. St. Ephraim's Hymns on Paradise, an excellent introduction because of the additional academic writings provided by Sebastian Brock, the critical edition, and finally the Apostolic Fathers, especially the Penguins edition with their explanations, is a really strong introduction into the early church. You can work through a whole genre of them in a few days of reading. I mean, it took me a week, but if you're really dedicated, these are epistles written by early church fathers who knew the apostles. That's why they're called the Apostolic Fathers. It's a whole genre of them that opens up your patristic reading. And then finally, the History of the Monks of Syria, a really good introduction into Syriac, Maronite history and spirituality. So those are my recommendations based on everything that I've read in 2024.